Well, hello, and welcome to another edition of Not Seeing My Face, but Hearing My Voice over some slides. Um, in this edition of the show, this section of podcast, no, I'm just kidding. Figured I'd try, see if it sticks. But the worst part is I wouldn't be able to hear you guys laugh anyway. But I'm pretty sure it wouldn't stick. Anyways, I just wanted to let you guys know that the next chapter in our saga is chapter 6. I usually let chapter 3, because it's so many little parts to it, I usually let that go for about a week and a half to 2 weeks. So I haven't yet decided um, if I'm going to put this chapter up next week or the week after. And I know we lost a week of time in the middle, so maybe I'll just put it up on Monday and, we'll see where expectations go. I normally do 2 lectures for this chapter, but seeing as it's only 22 slides or so, I figure I will just uh, do it all in one long take for this week, because it doesn't really matter. You guys can break it up into 2 parts if you want to, or listen to it again because you just love the sound of my voice. So this is chapter 6. We have now, in the grand scheme of things, finished chapter 3. So we have talked about all the little parts of the brain, the lobes of the brain, development of the nervous system, the 4 stages, being proliferation, migration, circuit formation, and then one that doesn't rhyme, so it's not as cool, but circuit pruning. When we get into the last chapter with the behavioral disorders, as we talk about things like schizophrenia, one of the theories of schizophrenia has to do with the fact that why don't we see it until usually around adolescence? And that happens to be because one of the theories, at least, says that maybe it's after that synaptic pruning that the issues are really uncovered, right? So I just wanted to bring that back. Anyways, chapter 6 is talking about that one area of the brain that's not getting its own cool name, the one that's right below the thalamus, called the hypothalamus, and how it is involved in our motivational system. And yes, there will be a assignment, which was originally an in-class sort of group assignment that will accompany this chapter. There were 4 sort of mega questions that you guys would work on in groups. So the way that this will work is that once you finish this chapter and these slides, listening to this video, then watching and listening, I guess, then you will choose one of the 4 questions, and you can answer any one of those 4 if you'd like. So let's see. In this chapter, we see the ideas of motivation and homeostasis from the point of view of the brain in our biology. We will talk about hunger, which is a very complex drive. What are the hormones and what are the peptides and neurotransmitters and things like that involved with hunger and thirst and temperature. We will then discuss obesity. A lot of people who also believe that addiction was just a lack of willpower also think that obesity is just a lack of willpower. And of course, as I've been changing minds and hearts this entire semester, I would like to challenge that notion and talk about the fact that it is also a big matter for genetics, because some people whose parents are on the obese side, they tend to put on weight easier or have a harder time taking it off and things like that. And then we will finish off with anorexia, bulimia, and one that wasn't considered an eating disorder originally, but has been added on in later times because we realize that when you have an eating disorder, that doesn't just mean one that's trying to get you to lose weight. Sometimes people turn to binge eating, and it causes them to gain weight, or things like that. But it's still a disorder because that's what they turn to in that time. And so the DSM has finally caught up to that. Let's hope that this works. There we go. Interesting the way this has come out. Hopefully it's okay. It's not so hard to see with the brain in the background, because in the normal slides, when it's not on this device, I believe there's a white background, so it's easier to see. But that's okay. We'll make do with what we got. So motivation, what do we mean by the brain's own motivation? Well, motivation is defined as to set in motion. So in this case, your brain motivates your body to initiate, sustain, and direct behaviors. So what does that mean? That means we get hungry because our energy levels are low. We get thirsty because our water levels, right, are low, and we need to replenish them. We don't always do it in the most responsible way. Water's kind of boring sometimes, but sometimes you need something with a little more caffeine or a little more flavor or a little more alcohol, depending on who you are. So looking at before we get to the theoretical approaches, because it kind of repeats on the next slide, I want you to pay attention to the graph on the right. And this is what we call an inverted U. Or as my son would call it, an N, lowercase n, kind of thing. So when we're looking at our performance, and I like to use the example of trying to study for an exam, right? When your arousal level is low, your performance is going to be low. Let's say that you had set yourself up to study for an exam, and you're feeling kind of tired. It's kind of late at night. You had to wait till people went to sleep, and your performance is going to suffer because your arousal level is really low. You're tired. So you need something like caffeine in order to boost you up. But remember, there's a fine line. You don't want to drink too much caffeine, because guess what happens? If your arousal level is too high, you're going to end up right at that same level of performance, right? As you can see, your optimal level is right in the middle. So if you need to caffeinate, maybe 1 cup of coffee or something like that would be perfect. At that point, you're nice and caffeinated. You are awake and alert, but not too much. And you are at an optimal level where you can get this studying done. If you were to drink 3 Red Bulls or 3 Monsters, you might want to bust through the wall like the Kool-Aid man. And guess what that's going to do to your performance? That's right. I don't have to wait for your reply to the computer screen for this. You will not do very well because you'll be all over the place. I was about to put in a Cornholio Beavis and Butthead reference, but I think that dates me a little bit. So I don't know that everybody's going to get that. Sorry. Moving back to our theoretical approaches to motivation. The first approach is instinct. This is something that we see across all species, not just humans. When we are hungry, when we are thirsty, it is our body's way. It is automatic. It is unlearned behavior. We go and get the things we need. I always see my dog getting up and going to the water bowl to get more water because she is thirsty. She has lost some water. She has gone on a long walk or something like that. So this is the one that occurs in all members of a species, and you don't need to be thinking about it in order for it to happen. It is just instinctual. We need food and water to survive, right? And things like that. So when it comes to it, our body responds the fastest to anything that is going to allow us to survive and continue to live. That's instinct. Drive theory is the theory that says that the body is motivated, the brain motivates the body to do things to maintain equilibrium in its systems. So we've already talked about this in a few different forms. The myelination of axons to allow for optimal performance of our neurons. We talked about glutamate and GABA having to be at the right appropriate optimal levels in order for our brain to function well, but not be too high in arousal or be too low in arousal, or our brain will probably start to look a little like that graph on the right. We talked about resting potential for the neurons at -70 when nothing else is happening. That's where it likes to be. That is our homeostasis. That's where it's most comfortable. When we talked about body temperature, which is a good segue to the next section, body temperature at 98.6 is perfect. A little higher and you're fevery, a little lower and you're hypothermic, your body is not going to respond as well. So when we talk about optimal homeostatic temperature, we like to maintain equilibrium between not too much and not too little activity in the brain, 98.6-ish degrees in the body. If we were to activate fight or flight, now we need to get back down to a normal level so our neurons do not crap out on us. So that's the idea behind drive theory. If we get energy levels a little low, that gives us the equilibrium, or to maintain equilibrium, we need to get more glucose or more water or more something like that. In order to maintain a nice temperature, we may have to sweat if we get a little too hot, or put something on if we get a little too cold. So drive theory says that our body's main level of motivation is to maintain equilibrium and homeostasis, to be in that normal functioning range, to be at that optimal level. So we just talked about the first two on here, automatic and unlearned behaviors, maintaining homeostasis. There's two more theories to this. Incentive theories is a newer one, and this one applies to humans specifically. Animals it can apply to too when we think about things like operant conditioning, where you're doing things in order to get a good reward. The incentive theory says that people are motivated by external stimuli. So if we have motivation to do something, a lot of times, if you're on a diet, you think about a cheat day. If you go to the gym so many times or maintain your diet so many days, why we go to work when we can go to work now is to get a paycheck, to get paid. So we are definitely motivated by external stimuli. If my son finishes all his little green trees, his broccoli, then guess what? He will get more likely than not dessert, and he loves sugar, as any 8-year-old would. So incentive theory says that we are motivated to do things for some type of reward or incentive. And then arousal theory is the last type of motivational theory that says that people behave to satisfy a certain level of sensation. A lot of these people that we call sensation seekers or adrenaline junkies are people that real life is kind of boring. So they're probably really going nuts right now if they're stuck at home. These are the people that go skydiving, cliff jumping, ride roller coasters, because real life maybe isn't exciting enough. Or some days you just need a little more excitement. So arousal theory says is that people behave in a certain way to satisfy a certain level of sensation. There is one of these questions that comes out of the 4 categories of questions from this chapter that asks you to think of one thing and apply it to all the theories. As an example, so please don't use this one, I like to use candy bars. Instinctually, if we're hungry, candy bars sound good to us, right? Maybe, unless you're not a fan of chocolate or candy. A bit of arousal if you need it. So that's sort of one way to answer all 4 of those with one example. Of course, we've seen challenges to drive theory in this case because the emphasis on drives is states of the brain rather than conditions of our tissues or conditions of the body. And that is because our brain is in charge of the body, right? We've already talked about how we're in charge of everything we do. So homeostatic drive is saying that the brain is in control of this stuff. The brain gets the signal when we're hungry, when we're thirsty, when we're hot or cold. And so that drive is sort of this control system that tries to maintain conditions. Some people feel that there's a set range. When we talk about weight, a little later in the chapter, there is a set range of weight. Sometimes people go up and down and fluctuate 3 to 5 pounds in either direction at any given time. And that's not what we mean by, putting on a lot of weight or losing a lot of weight or things like that. Some believe it's a set point, like 98.6. Some people believe it's a set range, kind of like we see again with weight and things like that. But drive theory seems to be pretty solid. It seems to make a lot of sense that we are driven, motivated to do things in order to maintain homeostasis. Because if I were to go back, this is where our optimal level of performance is, right in the comfortable range. We are not too caffeinated. We are not too tired. We are at an optimal level to learn. If our body is at an optimal level, we're at, at rest, -70 millivolts for the neurons. If we are at 98.6 degrees, if we are not in fight or flight, but not tired, we are at our optimal level for everything, right? So this idea of drive theory is that we're maintaining this nice optimal level so that we can do the most possible as humans. Now, one of those things that we've talked about, that we talked about in chapter 3 was with the hypothalamus was the 5 F's. First of all, if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that the hypothalamus is really just made up of a bunch of little smaller nuclei. There's probably about 20 of them in there, and no, we will not go over all of those. This is still a sophomore level class, right? But you can see that there are a bunch of different nuclei that make up this hypothalamus. And remember, we talked about how the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. So you can see there's a direct connection. Right below the thalamus is that pituitary gland that tells the glands, that's the master gland, that tells the other glands to secrete hormones. So we'll get into that when we talk about hunger and thirst and things like that. We see the lateral, we see the paraventricular or PVN. We see the preoptic, the anterior hypothalamus, suprachiasmatic, which actually controls your sleep-wake cycle. We're not going to get into the sleep chapter. So supra, meaning above, chiasmatic, meaning the optic chiasm, which is where the axons of the visual system cross. We'll talk about that in chapter 10. There's a ventromedial hypothalamus. The one that we're going to concentrate on for the next few slides is that preoptic area, and that just means in front of, before the optic nerve, which of course is the visual system going to the visual cortex from the eyes. So the preoptic area of the hypothalamus is one that receives information from the skin senses, specifically about temperature. Remember, we talked about the touch system and the fact that our skin tissue and skin neurons for the touch system that are embedded in the skin, again, chapter 11, is sending information to our touch system in the somatosensory cortex. That is going through the preoptic area of the hypothalamus before it goes through the thalamus and up to the somatosensory cortex. So first, let's talk about what separates us from some of the animals. Specifically in this case, we're going to talk about amphibians like lizards. Certain creatures are not certain creatures, certain animals like lizards and reptiles, some amphibians as well, most amphibians, cannot regulate their body temperature internally. They have to rely on sort of outside sources in order to keep them warm or cool. The nice thing about us and having a complex mammalian and especially human brain is that we are considered endotherms. So the ones that can't regulate their body temperature internally, lizards, amphibians, those are called ectotherms, ecto meaning outside. So they have to get their warmth from outside their body. They cannot regulate it inside. The nice thing about us, mammals, humans especially, is that we are what are known as endotherms. And it's because of this area of the brain. And yes, this area of the brain is also in lower animals like rodents and things like that. But they also have a hypothalamus. But we are endotherms, which means that we can maintain a fairly constant internal temperature. Yes, this is part of that drive theory. We don't do well when we have fevers. If you've ever had a fever, which pretty much everybody has, you would know that your level of functionality is not so great. If you're too cold, not so great either. You need to be in that optimal range. So as endotherms, the nice thing is this preoptic area of the hypothalamus can help us to regulate our temperature. It receives temperature from the blood and from the skin, And it allows us to do things like cause our pores to sweat and release perspiration in order to cool our system down if we're overheating. Or it can help us to at least signal us to do something like shiver or things like that try to create friction and warm us up. And of course, you can always put on and take off clothes, but that's something that we've learned, not something that our brain just says, hey, put on, take off clothes, right? Not an evolutionary thing necessarily. I guess there's a picture missing from here. Again, my apologies. But basically, this idea is looking at thirst. And by the way, I think I've pointed this out already in chapter 3, but I'm going to point it out again in this chapter, that the pictures, if they are missing from this slideshow, it must be that my computer system, I'm using a Chromebook, and so some of the graphics may not come out for some reason when it adapts to this, because the Chromebook really likes Google Docs and Google Slides better than PowerPoint and things like that. But the nice thing about this class is that you have been provided the written out notes of this, so you have the lectures that I'm giving you, and you have the written out ones. And the written out ones have these slides or pictures of these slides copied and pasted, so you can always go down to chapter 6 and look at the missing picture. But what this slide is telling us is that we actually have two different types of thirst in our system. Now, you may not know this because, I mean, when you're thirsty, you're thirsty. You want to get water at very least to replenish your system. If you've been playing sports, which nowadays not as much, you may want some Gatorade or things with electrolytes to not only replenish the water levels in your bloodstream and in your system, but also to replace your electrolytes, magnesium and sodium and things like that, which we now know are crucial and very important in allowing our neurons to communicate, especially sodium, right? So we don't want too much sodium that gives us high blood pressure and stuff like that, but you definitely want to put in a good amount that will make your neurons optimally useful. And when we're talking about motivation and optimal range, there you go. So two types of thirst. We only notice being thirsty, and let's shed some light on why. So the first type of thirst is called osmotic thirst. And yes, you may recognize that that word sounds like osmosis, and that is exactly where it came from. When the fluid in the cells drops. So we have two types of fluid. We have water with respect to the cells, like our neurons and our body cells, and we have water in our blood, right? That gives the blood its volume. So osmotic thirst is when fluid in our cells drop. So the water in the cells is low. And what the body does in response to this, because it needs water in the cells at all times, is before we can even replenish our body with water, we take or borrow water from the bloodstream in order to keep the cells nice and full. So when we get thirsty, when our body and our brain signals that we're actually thirsty, we're basically replenishing the water in the blood supply, and that's what's called hypovolemic thirst. So before we get to that, in osmotic thirst, there is a portion of the hypothalamus called the OVLT, and I'm not going to bother telling you what that stands for because it's a long word and you don't need to worry about it. You'd only see it as the OVLT. And what it does is the OVLT of the hypothalamus signals another nucleus that you're already familiar with, the preoptic nucleus. Median, of course, means the middle of that nucleus. So in the middle of the preoptic nucleus, just in front of the optic nerve, it signals us to drink. That's what makes us know that we are thirsty, lets us know that we're thirsty. Hypovolemic thirst, as I just talked about, is when the level of water in the blood volume drops. In this case, we're getting information from our kidneys. They're releasing kidneys are, in this endocrine system. So hypothalamus, pituitary tells the kidneys to release these chemicals called renin And what renin does is increases another chemical called angiotensin 2. In this case, the subfornical organ, which means below the fornix, you don't have to worry about what the fornix is. It wasn't mentioned in chapter 3, part of the limbic system. And again, it signals the median preoptic nucleus to drink. So, although there are two different types of thirst, again, the only reason that we only recognize one kind of thirst was just this, hey, I'm thirsty. I need something to drink. That's because with osmotic thirst in the first place, it borrows information, it borrows water from the bloodstream. So by the time our hypothalamus tells us that we're thirsty, it's probably all hypovolemic anyway, because the cells have just grabbed what they wanted from the blood. And when we drink to replenish our system, all we're doing is replenishing the bloodstream or blood volume. The other reason why you don't tell the difference is because it invokes the same part of the brain. It's the median preoptic nucleus for either type of thirst. So to us, there is no difference. In the body, when the cells get low, they just take it from the bloodstream. So really, by the time our body registers it, by the time our brain registers that we're thirsty, it's probably all hypovolemic anyway for us. I mean, unless you just gave blood or something like that and both are low, but it probably still feels the same. You just get parched. So that's how temperature works. That's how thirst works. Pretty straightforward in those things. With hunger, it's a little bit okay. It's a lot more complex or complicated. So temperature, we regulate ourselves. And thirst, we regulate ourselves, and they use basically the same nucleus for that. For hunger, it's a little bit more complicated. So first of all, we get signals from our brain, from our hypothalamus, that we are hungry. And hunger allows us to understand, it signals to us, it gives us the motivation that we need to eat something in order to replenish our levels of energy. And sometimes those levels, whatever we're lowest on, can actually cause us to crave certain types of foods. So the way that our taste system works is that taste buds on our tongue, called papillae, detect 5 different types of categories of chemicals. Taste and smell are chemical senses. So we have 5 different types of taste, or 5 signals from taste buds. We have sweet, which is sort of carbohydrates and glucose. We have salty. We have sour. We have bitter. Right? Protein has become a huge staple of our diet. Although it was before, it is even more important now. So when we talk about these things, right, you may realize that sometimes you get a craving for sweet foods. Sometimes you get a craving for salty snacks or things with salt in them. Sometimes you get a craving for something proteiny, like you need meat after you've worked out and things like that. We need to replenish our muscles. And in fact, without trying to get too gross or intimate, when women have a time of the month where they may be losing a little bit of blood, one of the things that I've heard from certain people is that they crave things like steak or burgers, even though they may not be big eaters of red meat or consumers of red meat. And that could be because the content of red meat has a lot of iron in it. And so if somebody's anemic, or if they're losing a lot of iron because of blood loss, then they may tend to crave something that has a little more concentration of iron. So we have motivation from our 5 senses of taste. Salt, sour, and bitter are the only ones that I have not talked about yet. And sour is really the way that our body or in our brain detects
sour or spoiled food. Now, not all sour is bad, but it is a sort of first line of defense that lets us know that this food supply may not be good. It may be past its expiration date. And bitter, I am very sensitive to bitter. So any vegetables that are bitter or things like coffee, I sound like a maniac right now when I say I don't like coffee because it's very bitter. And even if you put a whole bunch of sweetener in it, still tastes bitter to me. So bitter is a defense that your brain has for knowing that something is potentially toxic. Coffee, not so toxic, but things like rat poison or things you'd find under the sink, they would tend to first, if you were to ingest them, they would have a very bitter taste. And that could be your brain's way of saying, hey, wait, this stuff cannot get to the brain or it will kill me. So bitter is a way of detecting for toxic. So these have life-saving properties and motivational properties for us to um, be able to use that to our advantage. If you are craving something sweet or something bready, carbohydrates convert to glucose. And glucose is your body's energy supply. It's it spikes your blood sugar and it gives energy to the body and brain through the bloodstream. So if you are craving something sweet or something with carbohydrates, and maybe you've been low carb for a while, it's probably your body's way of telling you that you need this energy source. If you're craving something salty, it could be that you need these ions for better neural transmission or optimal neural transmission. So again, when we are craving certain foods, and this isn't the case all the time, but sometimes it could be our body's way of telling us that we are in need of more of a certain nutrient or chemical or thing like carbohydrates, glucose levels, salt or sodium levels, right? Things like that. So there is, as I just pointed out, evidence that taste preference and sensitivity are developed very early in life. Now that doesn't mean, that what you like at 2 years old is going to be your preference as you go forward. There's a lot of things that children do eat that they end up not eating later. My kiddo, Dr. C, was all about peas when he was 2, and now he couldn't. If you just show him a picture of a pea and he gets grossed out. But there are preferences for certain types of taste and things like that very early in life that have been seen through studies. How does hunger work? From the hunger system, we have signals that travel, right, or at least the taste system, from the taste buds through the thalamus, as I said, 4 of the 5 senses. They travel through to the insula, or the primary gustatory cortex, which is a little area underneath the prefrontal cortex, right above the nose. And they go through the nucleus of the solitary tract, which is actually part of the medulla. So taste buds kind of go around the long way, as opposed to smell, which does not go through the thalamus, and that just goes straight up into the insula or gustatory cortex. So we see the nucleus of the solitary tract, part of the medulla, we know about the thalamus, and then it gets redirected sort of to this insula at the end to be processed. We also have rules where obviously we get full if we've had enough food, and sometimes, in fact, a lot of times, we don't listen to our body's signals to stop eating. We stop because maybe we've paid for the food and we want to finish it if we paid good money for it, right? Or we're just people that like to eat until we realize, oh, maybe I shouldn't have eaten so much. So that feeling of being full is something that we call satiety. And one of the things that human evolution has given us, besides the cravings or signals for certain types of food or nutrients, like we just talked about, is that the more you eat of the same thing, the less appealing it gets, right? You may be really, really a big fan of pizza. I know I am. And you have this whole big pizza in front of you, but after you eat 2, 3, maybe 4 slices, the more you eat of it, the less you really want pizza. Maybe if you've eaten something for dinner, that a nice dessert sounds good, a little change of pace. But foods, the more you eat them, the more times in a row, or the more you eat them at one time, the more full you get and the less appealing that food is to you. And
which is in the medulla. Part of that pathway says, all right, I think we've had enough pizza. And I know some people, especially in college, are saying, what do you mean enough pizza? That's not a thing. Well, to some people, it might be. The other thing is that our body is really, and our brain is really good at understanding things that we like and things we don't like. So things that make us sick are things that we tend to stay away from. And this is especially true if it's the very first time that we've ever paired a taste with being sick. So if you are a person who enjoys Chipotle, um, and there's a lot of people that do. My wife is not one of them because she has gotten sick from there more than once, actually. But there's this idea we call learned taste aversion. So if you had been, um, eating on a regular basis, once in a while, once every week, once a day, who knows how much you love Chipotle, and you eat there, and one day you get sick, and maybe there was some reason why uh, food wasn't prepared right, or maybe it was a fluke, and you probably would treat it as such. You may stay away from the restaurant establishment for a week or two, maybe a month, or maybe you'll just go to a different location than the one that made you sick. But you wouldn't tend to say, you know what, that's it, nope, never again, most of the time, as if you're used to eating it. However, if it's the first time you ever were um, tried a food like Chipotle, if it's the first time you ever tried it and it made you sick, chances are you would never, ever, 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 ever go there again, because your brain makes the connection. It's a classical condition response. Remember that Pavlov guy and Watson? And in that, um, your brain automatically makes that connection between trying that food and it giving you a bad reaction. This happened to me when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I was watching the Dodgers, my beloved Dodgers, and this was, don't uh, don't try to do the math on this, but the last time they won the World Series, it was the year they won. And I had been introduced to a brand new flavor of Doritos that had pretty much just come out. At least they were new to me. And I was a huge fan of nacho cheese Doritos. So these were called Cool Ranch. I'm like, all right, let's give them a try. I wasn't even paying attention to what I was eating because I was so enthralled and engulfed in the Dodger game. So this was well before the time of those little individual bags of chips that you'd get to go to school, or just as a snack size. So we had the big family size. And as a little tiny 8-year-old, I was probably about the size of Dr. C, which is not very big. Um, I had, before I knew it, eaten about a third of the bag. And well, let's just say a little bit later, before the game even ended, it all came back up. So to this day, Cool Ranch Doritos make me grossed out. I've gotten to the point where if my son's eating them, as long as I can't smell them, we're good. But any ranch dressing or anything like that, I know I'm weird. That's okay. You can make your comments out loud because I won't hear you. But he doesn't even like ranch. Yep, that's right. So this idea of learned taste aversion says that we avoid foods that are associated with illness and ones that are associated with poor nutrition. However, evolutionarily, we know that we tend to like a lot of things that are not necessarily nutritious for us, right? And in fact, we can use them sometimes as incentives or rewards when we talk about motivation. But with this learned taste aversion, we also have learned taste preferences, which again could have been developed from a very early young age. We have a preference for flavors of food that contain the needed nutrients. So people that love carbohydrates, it could be in the form of sweets, it could be in the form of breads, right? It doesn't have to be exactly the same thing for everybody, but people have their preference. Some people don't like sweet as much, but they do like really bready things, like bagels, maybe. Others may like their sweets better and not have things so bready. Um, of course, this idea of learned taste preference, as I said, can and is often counteracted by tasty, high-calorie foods. So if you're craving a piece of cake, that does not necessarily mean that your body needs any more glucose in it. It just means, hey, I like cake. So I'm just letting you know that. We're not talking about, craving this ultimate decadent thing that may not exactly have nutrients in it very much. So, going back into this idea of hunger, we are looking at the pathway, and we're looking at how the signals get to the brain and back. Before we get to that point, though, we have to talk about how food is broken down by the body in order to break it down into the nutrients that we need in the body and in the brain. And so some of you guys may know some of this stuff, or you may not, and so you'll get to learn it now. We actually start breaking down food right away once it hits our mouth. Our mouth, and I know that a lot of people don't like the word moist, but I don't know if there's a better word for it. We have to keep our mouth not dry. So MOIST, guys. And the reason for that is because the saliva in our mouth, the spit, whatever you want to call it, is actually starting to break food down the minute we start chewing it, the minute it gets mixed up in our mouth. And that's because all of the starches that we eat, actually, we can extract the glucose right away. Remember, glucose is the one that goes, well, I guess not remember, but now you know, glucose is the one that goes straight to the brain before it goes anywhere else. And so we can start to break down these starches into glucose right at the level of the mouth before it even goes down the esophagus and into the stomach. Once the glucose is extracted, sorry, I was distracted. The food goes down the esophagus and into the stomach. You guys are probably pretty aware that the stomach has acids in it that break down more components of the food. These acids are called hydrochloric acid and pepsin. Yes, that sounds like Pepto-Bismol. That's why Pepto-Bismol is called that, because it basically helps to, when there's an overproduction of pepsin and things like that, and it causes our stomach to hurt, that's what Pepto is doing, is it's coating the stomach so we don't feel the effects of that. But these two types of chemicals, hydrochloric acid and pepsin, mix with the food, and what they do is they digest the proteins and break them down into the essential amino acids that our body needs to function. This includes things like proteins that have the amino acids in them. From the stomach, the rest of the waste goes through this pathway between the stomach and the intestines called the duodenum. The duodenum actually is where, in that tube right there, where the fats or fatty acids are extracted from the rest of the food that we eat, which are important for the body, as well as glycerol, which helps to convert glucose and things like that. And that's broken down by the bile ducts and the bile in the intestines. Anything else that is not kept, that is not nutrient rich, all the rest of that food material comes out as waste and goes out through the rectum. We poop it out. Yep, I said it. Not everything that we eat is clean, as you probably are well aware, especially if you are a big fan of pizza. And so some of the toxins, or some of the stuff that's not good for the body, that we don't just poop out, has to go through the liver, because the liver cleans our blood in our system. So some of that extra waste that could be considered dangerous or not good goes through the hepatic portal vein, and it transports products to the liver in order to clean out our system the best that it can. So this is sort of how we metabolize the food. When we are eating
our body is actually in two different states. One is called absorptive phase, when we're actually hungry and ingesting food. And then our body, of course, is still processing these fats and proteins and glucose levels while we're not hungry, because we do spend a good portion of our day not eating. If you're doing it right, most of the day you're not eating, and then there's times where you do eat. So when we are hungry, um, we actually have two sort of ways that we decide whether or not we're hungry. One that more people have is sort of an external one, where, oh, it's a certain time of day, so it's time to eat, or, oh, we see food, so we go and get it because, oh, well, there it is, it looks good. But the internal types of hunger are when you get the stomach growling, or you get maybe the certain cravings because your body is and your brain is telling you that you're low on these certain things. So when we are low, that's what signals that we should probably start eating something, because we are low on these essential nutrients: glucose in carbohydrates, fatty acids and fats, as well as proteins. So when we are in the absorptive phase, our body is telling us, our brain is telling us that we are low on these nutrients. So we need to eat foods in order to extract those nutrients and refill our levels, right? This is part of that drive theory. So when we are in the absorptive phase, our glucose increases because our body, right, breaks down carbohydrates into glucose. And this causes parasympathetic activation. Why would we call this parasympathetic? Well, if you recall, the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is one that I called the rest and, that's right, digest system. So we are increasing digestion because we need to digest the food, metabolize it, extract the right chemicals or nutrients and things like that. And to help maintain blood sugar levels, the pancreas secretes insulin. If you guys did not know, people that are diabetic, which have to take external insulin, is because the pancreas no longer secretes its own, and we cannot control the levels. Those people, not we, those people cannot control the levels of um, glucose within their blood. And if there's too much, just like we talked about with optimal levels of homeostasis, it's bad. If your blood sugar is too low, it's also bad. So we need to be, like that first graph, in the optimal range. So how does this work? Glucose enters the body through cells. It is stored in the liver and muscles as a component called glycogen. And later, if we need it because we don't have enough glucose, glycogen can then be turned back into glucose and used as energy for our body. Any of the fats that we have are anything extra, of course, is stored in these adipose, or the fat cells, as what we call triglycerides. Once we are full, and the actual first signal that we're full, that our body doesn't always listen to from our brain, is that we have already filled up our nutrient levels, our glucose levels, and things like that, protein levels, fat levels, to a sufficient level, to a sufficient degree, and then we don't need to eat anymore. But sometimes the signal is slow, sometimes we just ignore the signal most of the time, and we just keep eating. Especially, like I said, if we have that incentive, external motivation of, hey, I paid money for this, I'm going to finish it, right? So, but once the absorptive phase is over, then we're good. In the fasting phase, once our levels are, you know, up to snuff, once they're leveled off, once they're sufficient, then we stop eating, in theory. And as we are continuing to go throughout our day, we're in the fasting phase. Glucose is going to decrease as it is being used in the body for energy. We are activating the sympathetic nervous system, at least to a little degree. We're stopping digestion because we don't need to digest anymore. And the pancreas, instead of insulin to keep this sort of steady, is going to secrete what we call glucagon. And glucagon helps to transform glycogen back into glucose. So if we go back to the top part, we see that glucose when it is being stored, it's stored in the liver and muscles as glycogen. So the pancreas is going to secrete a chemical called glucagon, and glucagon is going to transform glycogen back into glucose so that the brain can use it as energy. And stored fat is going to be released as fatty acids in order for the body to get the right nutrients. And for the brain, it's transformed again into glycerol. After it's converted to glucose, we get glycerol, which further helps to give the energy to the brain. So we get two types of thirst we talked about, osmotic and hypovolemic. Just as a reminder, osmotic is low levels of water in the cells. They just take it from the blood. And hypovolemic thirst is low levels of water in the blood volume. We have two types of hunger that we have. And again, we just know hungry, although sometimes we get certain cravings that may tell us the type of hunger we have. We have hunger from low glucose, which we call glucoprivic, like you're being deprived of glucose, your body is. And so low blood sugar and things like that can make us a little weak, a little lightheaded. Or we get hunger from low amounts of fatty acids, which is called lipoprivic, where we may have a craving for something that has a lot of fat or fatty acids to it. Either way, very similar to the thirst system, in the hunger system, ghrelin is released. And ghrelin is the peptide that is released by the stomach that goes through the bloodstream up to the brain in the endocrine system and tells our brain, especially the hypothalamus, that, hey, we are hungry. So ghrelin goes up through the same area that we talked about with taste, the nucleus of the solitary tract, which is in the medulla. So from the stomach, what we see is ghrelin, and you can see it in the green pathway at number 3, from the stomach up to the hypothalamus, to a nucleus in the hypothalamus called the arcuate nucleus. And arcuate means arced, and you can see it at the bottom. You see LH, PVN, and towards the bottom of the hypothalamus, you see ARC. That's the arcuate nucleus, which just means it's curved. The arcuate nucleus is there to receive the signal of ghrelin from the stomach, and it monitors our nutrient levels. If we need more nutrients in response to hunger, whether it's glucoprivic or lipoprivic, what it does is it releases two more chemicals, two more hormones, peptides. One is called neuropeptide Y, or NPY, and it releases AGRP. Again, we don't need to worry about longer names. You can always read them in the book. When neuropeptide Y and AGRP are released, they cause activation in both the paraventricular nucleus above the arcuate nucleus and in the lateral hypothalamus. And when the PVN and the LH, or lateral hypothalamus, are stimulated by these peptides, right? And we talk about chemical flow. So these peptides are released by neurons that go from the arcuate nucleus to the paraventricular and the lateral hypothalamus, and it tells us that it's time to start eating. It triggers hunger and eating in our bodies. So that's the green pathway. And then, of course, once our cup filleth, once our cup hopefully not runneth over, but once our levels are filled, then we have signals from the stomach and signals from that go through this pathway that tell us to stop eating because, hey, we're done. So moving forward, if it lets me, our stomach has little receptors called stretch receptors, which tell when it's stretched out. So we have put enough food into our tummies, put enough food into our stomach that it activates these stretch receptors. And when they're stimulated, and when not only the stretch receptors, but when food is broken down and starts to enter that phase in the duodenum, where it's pulling out fatty acids and things like that, the intestines release their own chemicals that go back up through the bloodstream to the brain. And these chemicals that induce stopping of eating, or the satiety, as we called it, are called cholecystokin, or CCK. Again, that's why some of these, it's just easier to know the abbreviations. And what CCK does is it inhibits the area of that nucleus of the solitary tract, which you can see on the right-hand side in the brainstem. And CCK inhibits the nucleus of the solitary tract, so it also inhibits stimulation of that lateral hypothalamus. And the arcuate nucleus is the one that sends information to the lateral hypothalamus, as we just talked about. I know it's a little confusing. I apologize. Yes, there will be a chart for all of these things. So if we want to stop eating, we need to inhibit activity in the lateral hypothalamus. We need to inhibit activity at the arcuate nucleus and that pathway that leads to them, which is the nucleus of the solitary tract. So that's what CCK does. And also peptide YY, PYY, inhibits the arcuate nucleus. So we have slowed down our eating as we're getting full and as we're feeling full, and then we stop eating. Our eating slows down. Now, what ensures that we're not going to get hungry again 5 minutes later is that our fat cells actually release a chemical called leptin. And leptin says, hey, we're good. Our cells are full. We don't need to eat for a little while. And so unless you're meeting up with one of your friends, which is hard to do these days, and just the sight of food sometimes can be enough to motivate you to say, hey, I want to eat, even though your brain isn't necessarily hungry. Then leptin allows us to go a few hours at least between meals. And I guess that depends on your habits, because there are some nutritionists that say eating a little bit every 2 hours is better than eating 3 big meals a day. But it's CCK, it's peptide YY, and it's leptin as the chemicals that signal us to stop eating, the red pathways, inhibit our eating. Hey, we're full, let's stop. So here, as I promised, is our chart. When we start meals, because we are either glucoprivic or lipoprivic, our body needs glucose and fatty acids. The liver and nutrients in the blood seem to be depleted. And so from this nerve called the vagus nerve, which is the one I sort of pointed out when we freezing behavior, when we're scared, goes through the nucleus of the solitary tract to the arcuate nucleus. So that, and then in the brain, we need glucose. So there are receptors near this fourth ventricle, and that's from the NST or medulla to the arcuate nucleus. And of course, the stomach itself is sending signals called through ghrelin. Ghrelin goes through the bloodstream and also up to the arcuate nucleus, and that causes the arcuate nucleus to send information to the PVN and to the LH, the lateral hypothalamus, and that's what starts our eating. When we are done, it is because our stomach stretch receptors say, hey, we're full. And the stomach sends out CCK. And the stomach and the intestines send CCK up to the brain through the vagus nerve to the nucleus of the solitary tract. So from the blood to the brain. For long-term hunger that lets us know we need to stop eating, we have peptide YY, which shuts off the arcuate nucleus. We have leptin by the fat cells that say, hey, our cells are full, we're good. And we have insulin that controls levels of blood sugar in our blood, right? It controls glucose levels in the blood. And again, those that cannot regulate their own insulin, that's why they take insulin. Those are called diabetics. So, if you have any questions about the hunger system, please feel free to ask me, but I tried to give you as much information as I could. Now we get into the last sort of section, the second half of this lecture, which is talking about obesity. And I absolutely cannot stand this body mass calculation chart for adults. One of the things that this has been created, and it hasn't really been perfected very well,
in recent years. It's sort of an archaic or very old way of thinking about things. So if you're looking at this, on the left-hand side, you see body height, and on the top, going across the top, you see weight in pounds. Now, one of the things that it doesn't take into account is fat versus muscle. So somebody like The Rock, let's talk about The Rock, right? The Rock is like 6'3", and he weighs somewhere around 260 pounds. Most of that, his body fat percentage is probably close to zero, but yet if he's over, 250 pounds, that just looking at a chart without knowing who he is, he would be considered obese, because they're not taking into account that that weight is from muscle or if it's from fat. So the problem is they don't really have a better system than this. So you don't really get, right? It's not always necessarily accurate. So looking at this, somebody that's 5 feet tall, if they are 130 pounds, they are in the yellow range, which is sort of the high body fat, or body mass index. And if they're in red, that means obese. Yellow is overweight, green is you're good. So even somebody that's 6'4", if you're anywhere over 200 pounds, even at 205 pounds, you're in the yellow, right? And somebody who is 5'5", that's at 180 is in the obese category or getting up there. So although we don't have a better system, this one is highly flawed, and it has a lot of criticism, especially from this guy. I'm pointing to myself. So let's get away from that for a little bit. What we know about obesity is that your body mass index is over 29, I think it is. And those that are at risk for obesity, that are highly, overweight, according to that chart, does not necessarily mean that you are going to have all of these disorders, but it does put you at higher risk. Remember, correlation is not the same as causation. So people who are overweight or are considered obese, it is correlated with a higher risk of developing diabetes type 2. Type 1 is juvenile, or you're born with it or develop it as a kid. Type 2 is adult onset, and that's sometimes tied to obesity and weight gain as you get older. Of course, more weight means more mass. It means more work for the cells to do. So more blood that has to pump through the system. So not only are they at a higher risk of diabetes, they're at a higher risk of heart disease because they may be clogging arteries and blocking blood flow to and from the heart. High blood pressure itself. Strokes, which are basically, as we talked about in the last chapter, blood clots like a heart attack, but in the brain. They're higher at risk for colon cancer, where food is going through the colon to be excreted, food waste, I should say, and all of this could cause a reduced lifespan. That's in the body. What about in the brain? Well, we do see reduced activity in the temporal lobe. There have been associated that overweight people, obese people may have some cognitive decline, and they tend to be a little bit higher risk for Alzheimer's disease, one of the, I guess we would call those environmental factors. So obesity itself has become a global epidemic, and what we've actually seen over the last, oh man, now that's 40 years since 1980, is that the amount of people that have been diagnosed as obese has doubled since 1980 in the last 40 years. We have seen a lot of increases in fast food in this world, microwave, things like that, things at our fingertips, delivery, things like that. So we can see that obesity is a BMI, again, of 30 or above 30. And we also see underweight, which is mostly a consequence of third world country and not being able to eat. So we have seen that globally, obesity has gone way up, as well as underweight and famine. In the least developed countries, you don't see obesity as a risk
yes, you are far more likely to be, there's far more cases of obesity than there is being underweight or underfed.
So, again, much like drug addiction, obesity has a lot of myths about it, that people are addicted to food, that they can't control their impulses, that it's poor eating styles, that they succumb to the temptations to eat. And what we know is there's a lot of people that are in the obese range that actually have diets that are better than most people, definitely better than me. They eat very little because they think that what they eat contributes. And they are also, people with body types where they can eat and eat and eat and eat more than these people who show up as obese or are categorized as obese. And those people never seem to gain much weight. So a lot of it has to do with metabolism, and a lot of it has to do with genetics, which of course controls for metabolism and things like that. That's why some people can exercise just a little bit and lose a decent amount of weight, and some people can eat, restrict their diet and exercise and still not seem to lose much weight, because that's the body's set range, right? We talk about set point or set range and things like that. So looking at contributions, the environment does contribute somewhat, like we talked about with nature and nurture, but moreover, you're going to find that it is genetics that lead to people's dispositions. So from this figure, you can see, if we look at twin studies, right, identical twins that are reared, that were in the same household, tend to be 75% similar to one another. Identical twins that were reared apart, that had different maybe eating habits because they were separated, adopted families or things like that, you still see about 62, 63% the same as their others. Fraternal twins, right, if this wasn't genetic, you wouldn't see much of a difference between identical and fraternal twins. Just to remind you, identical twins are 100% DNA match, and fraternal twins or womb-mates, 50% match. With fraternals in the same house, you see only about 35, 36% similarity in body mass index, which means that genetically, identical twins more similar, a higher percentage. We can see a huge genetic factor here. The heritability rates of obesity are in the range of 50 to 90%. So a lot of it has to do with what mom and dad gave you. And BMR, which stands for basal metabolic rate, that's your metabolism, for those of you playing at home, which is everybody, is a 40% heritability rate. So your metabolism, how fast or slow your metabolism is, and whether or not you have genes related to obesity is very much genetic. So what are these genes? There's an obesity gene called the OB gene. There's a diabetes gene called the DB. And again, you may have heard that diabetes skips a generation in people. Sometimes it doesn't. I can tell you that I'm probably screwed eventually because I share most of my dad's side genetics, but both grandparents on both sides had diabetes. Both my parents had diabetes. My brother got it around 23 years old. My dad didn't get it till 50, but he also never exercised, so I'd like to think that I'm ahead of the game there. But it seems that I'll probably, within a few years, have something close to that, if we just look genetically. So boo to that. But what are you going to do? There's also a gene called the FTO gene. It's not super important to know exactly what this is for the exam, so I'm going to just show you the A allele of the FTO gene can also contribute to body weight and obesity. In the environment, we have, what you eat. Some people who eat things and they can't metabolize them so fast, it gets stored as fat. Some people's fat is stored a lot easier than others. And some people never gain weight, really. And that's just how it is. But environmental factors could be things like trauma. It could be things like whether you eat by external means or internal means. And definitely people that are overweight or on the obese side tend to use the external cues of what's around, what they feel like, what time of day it is. Oh, it's noon, I have to eat, as opposed to people who are underweight or in a normal range. A lot of times they wait till their stomach growls, or they wait till their body tells them these hormones, ghrelin, things like that, that they need to eat. So gene expression can change. We talked about these epigenetic changes where one gene that overregulates can cause another gene to downregulate or turn on or turn off. And so gene expression changes could happen based on the environment. We could, emotions and sadness can make us eat more, stress. Sometimes that makes us eat less. It depends on the person, and things like that. And that are changes in the AGRP gene as well that codes for how much AGRP is released. Going back, I noticed, I wanted to show you guys that if we genetically alter mice, the nice thing about mice is that we can genetically alter them without any consequence. You can insert or delete genes from mice, and the next generation of mice will be born with or without those genes. And as long as it's not going to harm their health, overall life, they are pretty easy to insert or delete genes from a mouse genome, which is pretty cool. So if we were to put both sets of obesity genes in a mouse, as you can see on the right under the hereditary chart, is an OB-OB mouse. As you see, figure 616. That is a mouse that has both from mom and dad, or we've added the obesity gene. And that mouse itself, right, is bigger than two regular mice on a scale, a lot bigger. You'd probably need at least a third or a fourth mouse to do that. And we can see, so we can essentially give a mouse the obesity gene and make mice obese so we can study them. Now, what we see is our BMR, basal metabolic rate. And what this is defined as the energy required to fuel the brain and body. So basically, it is 75% of our energy expenditure when we're not doing anything, when we're resting. Our metabolism is breaking down foods, it's breaking down nutrients, and it is allowing us to function. So when we look at the average diet, I know that most indicators say our calorie intake is at about 2,000 per day, or at least that was the old one. A newer one says that the average calories per day, and again, that depends on who you are, what your age is, a lot of these different factors, is at about somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 calories a day. And a lot of us, myself included, most days go way over. So our body is used to a certain point. It's determined by this set point or set range. For most people, their body says if you don't overconsume, if you stay in the same calorie range, then you're going to maybe fluctuate between 3 and 5 pounds each way, but you're going to stay about the same weight if you maintain the same amount of caloric intake and the same amount of exercise or energy expenditure. So we would know that based on this system, right, that if people went on a restricted diet and restricted the amount of calories that they ate, that maybe we would see these fluctuations or changes in weight. But when this was done, when the study was done, what they found was that 1/3 of the women on a restricted diet did not lose weight, even though they restricted the amount of calories they ate. And of course, nutritionists tell you, oh yeah, it's very simple. You just stop eating so much. And if you reduce the amount of caloric intake and maybe increase your exercise, because of, again, that would help to increase your metabolic rate because you're burning more energy. Just women who just restricted their diet didn't lose weight. And sure enough, it's because they had lower basal metabolic rates. So even though
their caloric intake went down, because their metabolism was low, it still didn't burn as much off, and we didn't really see, or they didn't really see, much change. In fact, prolonged weight change can actually shift your set point. But let's think about this, right? Because it may be easy for you to say, oh, when you stop eating or you reduce the amount of calories you eat, that it's going to make your metabolism go up. And when you eat more, you're making your metabolism go down. It's actually the opposite if you really think about it, and that's the way it really is. Because if you are used to eating a certain amount of calories per day, and then you're like, oh, I need to lose some weight, so I'm going to not eat so much. Guess what your body is saying? Your body's like, wait, we're used to a certain amount. Your brain says we're used to a certain amount of calories, and you're not giving us that much. So not only are you going to be hungry because your hunger producing hormones are like, hey, we didn't tell you to stop, right? But your body's going to think that there's some sort of problem going on, and it's going to get defensive. So metabolism is actually going to go down in response to eating less, because your body thinks that you are in a sort of famine period, like the ice age came back again, and we need to conserve as much of this as possible because we're not getting enough. If you eat more than than you normally do, your metabolism actually goes up because your body is trying to maintain that set point and that set range. So if you eat more, if you're increasing your caloric intake from what your body is used to and your brain is used to, your metabolism is actually going to go up, saying, oh, we need to compensate for this. But of course, if you are gaining a lot of weight over an extended period of time, or if you're losing a lot of weight over an extended period of time, this weight change not only shifts metabolism, but can also shift the set point. So people that continue to gain weight, their body is adjusting to a brand new shift, a brand new set point or set range. So you will no longer be, if you gain a bunch of weight, you're no longer going to be at 180 to 185. You're going to be, your new set point is going to be wherever you're, whatever you go up to or down to necessarily. But people that go down, the problem is that your fat cells don't zap, they shrink, which means that they can be elongated again, kind of like when you blow up a balloon. If it doesn't pop and then you let all the air out, the balloon is bigger and all out of shape, and it's a lot easier for that balloon to get bigger again as you go through. So if you're wondering why people that lose a lot of weight, if they don't maintain that regimen, they go back up to where they were, it's because that's where their body's set point is. So now you know. So dietary restriction can be effective depending, of course, if you have a higher metabolic rate than others. But it's especially effective when it's coupled with exercise. So this is true, and nutritionists, preach this every day. When we looked at that same study of formerly obese women that were on a diet, 33% did not, 33% that, oh, sorry, this is a different study. When exercising afterwards, 90% that exercise kept the weight off. When they did not exercise, only about 33% kept the weight off. And that would have to do with genetics and metabolic rate. So again, we point out, I am quick to point out, the book is quick to point out that prolonged weight change can shift the set point, and it can make it the new normal range. Medication is not necessarily effective in taking the weight off or keeping it off. We can use medications like, and we'll talk about this, and I'll talk about this in a sec, that work through increasing levels of serotonin, which are like SSRIs, like antidepressants. Some drugs can increase the amount of leptin that make us feel like we're not full, or that we are full and we don't need, right? That's the long-term peptide or hormone that is secreted by the intestines that tells us we're good for a while. Insulin, of course, which controls our blood glucose levels. Or through decreased fat absorption, which you may have heard of from these fat blocking pills. Some of them have been promising, but they don't necessarily work for all patients. And one of the things that we really don't want people to do is these wonder weight loss drugs, right? So you see these commercials sometimes for things like hydroxycut and things like that. Those are the new generation, quote unquote, fat dissolving or rapid weight loss pills. Those things really don't work like that. What they do is we do have do. Anyway, sorry, I'm kind of stir crazy in here. What they do is cause more water loss. So sometimes people retain water and things like that. So you're losing the water weight, not necessarily the fat weight. And it may give you the appearance that it's happening. And some people say, "Oh, I went on hydroxycut and I lost a lot of weight." Well, those are probably that's more of a placebo, because those people are also probably dieting and exercising and not realizing that it's like Dumbo's magic feather. Um, the newest kind of those weight loss are called thermogenics, and they actually work and help to decrease water levels because they increase your body temperature slightly, not enough to give you a fever, but that causes your metabolism to start burning off a little more, at least while the pill is going through its cycle. So that may work a little better than your whatever hydroxycut or whatever the other ones are called, but I'm sorry, it's like snake oil. I wouldn't trust those rapid weight loss pills like hydroxycut. Um, and I don't know if they have any side effects because I've never taken them, but I know that the one thing you have to worry about with medication, including antidepressants and things like that, is that they can have significant side effects, right? Some people in the 1980s, the way to do it was to do the cocaine diet because they realized, as we talked about in chapter 5, that stimulants actually, one of the side effects is that they decrease your appetite. So a lot of people that were on coke or meth or amphetamines or things like that would lose a lot of weight simply because they were never hungry. So another slide where you don't see the picture, but again, if you go down to the chapter 6 where I've written them out, you can see the picture. It is showing the basal ganglia and in the brain, and what we're looking at is that and one of the things we've talked about in chapter 5 is that obesity and addiction to food is going through that same pathway of dopamine. Remember, from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens, right? The mesolimbocortical pathway. And so we see that obese people that could be addicted to food, right, share several characteristics with people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol. And one of the things that we see is reduced dopamine receptors in the basal ganglia area, nucleus accumbens area, and reduced prefrontal metabolism. So sometimes this can be treated by peptides that induce eating. And when we do that, we talked about those peptides, right, like ghrelin and things like that, um, and those neuropeptide Y. And when they do that, they also increase dopamine to a degree. So increasing some of those dopamine or increasing serotonin, sometimes anti-addiction drugs can be effective in weight loss for patients. Because again, it could be, partially from an addiction to food. Let's see, are we going to be able to? There we go. So, of course, if you are morbidly obese and you are at a much higher risk for stroke, heart disease, colon cancer, diabetes, and early termination of life because your body can't handle the mass that it is working with every day, more blood supply, less energy, all of that stuff. Originally, this was just as an option for the morbidly obese to be able to live, so they could reduce their fat. Now it's been more of a cosmetic surgery for people that are, oh, well, I don't want to get there and this, and I wouldn't recommend it unless it's absolutely necessary because it has its drawbacks and it has its problems. But gastric bypass surgery, where either the stomach is stapled to so that it can't hold as much food, or nowadays, to make it a little easier and a little less stapley, they put a sleeve on the stomach so that it can't expand, right? Kind of like putting a sleeve, one of those sleeves on your arm, um, to help regulate blood flow and stuff like that. So for the morbidly obese, weight loss averages about 25% of your body weight, 1/4 of your body weight after 10 years, whereas most of those people that diet and even exercise may only lose about 5 to 10%, and a lot of them relapse, just like we see in drug addiction. Um, One of the other things that, besides keeping your stomach in check and those stretch receptors, is that it reduces ghrelin, increases peptide YY, and another hormone or peptide called GLP-1, which tends to reduce hunger. So not only do you not put as much in, but they tend to not get as hungry. And so that can really help in weight loss for the morbidly obese, which are at a high risk for dying early. So the biggest benefits, which is why this surgery was invented, is to reduce mortality and allow people to live longer, and to help improve their health and maybe even reverse the effects of um, type 2 diabetes. Now, the last thing we're going to end on is the types of eating disorders that people have. And again, a lot of times there's a lot of misnomers that go around. People think, especially us that live in Los Angeles near all the actors and actresses and models and all of these people, that this idea of wanting to be thin is just an environmental thing. But that is absolutely untrue, and you should already know this based on the fact that you're taking a class that is based on the biological side of things. So anorexia nervosa is known as the starving disease. In this case, this is a person who eats little to nothing, restrictors, so they reduce their food intake to maintain weight. They eat the absolute bare minimum that they can get away with, um, and there is a big battle of hormones and peptides in the brain and in the body. Neuropeptide Y and ghrelin are always really high, telling us, hey, we're hungry, our body needs nutrients. Leptin, that tells us we're full, is always really low, but they are able to put mind over matter in that case and really do that. Some people with anorexia, not everybody, just some people, will also excessively exercise to even keep that calorie intake basically in the negative. Um, and no matter how skinny or frail or sick they are, when they look in the mirror, they feel like they're still not. Um, let's compare that to bulimia. In bulimia, what we have is binging and purging cycles, which means they eat 2 to 3 times the amount of a normal meal, and then they throw it up before the body can absorb a lot of those extra nutrients. These people tend to lose weight as well, but not nearly in the same way, and not nearly be as thin as the people who suffer from anorexia. So they're usually at more of a normal weight. They eat larger meals and then vomit the food back up. But we see, even when they try to stop, we see high relapse rates. And one of the reasons why is because once you start this cycle, and I've seen this, that it's an automatic trigger. It's like your brain learns like classical conditioning. So even when they try to stop, they may automatically start to throw the food up anyway, because it's basically a triggered reaction. Um, so those are the two main ones that we always had sort of as our eating disorders, and those are the differences between them. They both potentially result in weight loss, so that's the sort of connection between them, the similarities they have. And then there's binge eating disorder, because we didn't think about this, or at least psychologists didn't really think about this as a thing before the last 10 or 15 years. But what about people who eat a lot and people who gain weight? They didn't think of that as an eating quote unquote disorder, but of course it is, because it is contributing to obesity. It is a stress response, right? A lot of times. And it is people eating a lot more than their body is trying to allow them to eat. Um, So that is also considered a disorder that they cannot control. So what are some of the environmental contributions? Well, of course, I've already talked about cultural emphasis on thinness. So cultural, especially in LA. There is a study that you can read about in the book called the Fiji study, which talks about that people should be thin and maintain a certain body type image. Of course, we see with eating disorders that the incidence is a lot higher in females. And environmentally, females are the ones that experience more pressure. Um, if they, especially if they're in the media, in the spotlight, and they gain a couple pounds, it might be very noticeable to people, and people may make comments or ask if they're pregnant or things like that. But overall, with looks, females are much more likely to feel that burden. As men age, they get um, better with age, like fine wine, and they become silver foxes and this and that. Um, Women, as they age, they're just like, oh, okay, right? So we see a lot of this in the environment, and the pressure is more on women than men. When we get to the last chapter, we'll talk about how there's more. Whoop! There goes an email. How there's higher depression rates and anxiety rates in women than men, and some of that could be environmental too. But as is the nature of this class, and nature, yes, that was on purpose, genetic influence says that identical twins have 3 times more concordance rates than fraternal twins to have eating disorders. So there's a huge genetic component that people don't realize for eating disorders. Heritability rates for anorexia are above 50%, 56% for anorexia, between 54 and 83% for bulimia, and almost 50% for binge eating disorder. So we see a huge genetic component here. We see, again, identical twins are much higher to have those rates than fraternal twins together. Um, Stress hormones can go out of whack. So a lot of times we see increases or decreases in weight when people hit puberty. Adolescent stress, hormones out of control, and specific dieting may produce epigenetic changes. We talk about these crash diets as well, right? One of the things that is bad about diets is that diets can actually harm your metabolism system and your whole system there, because crash diets, your body is not meant to go to extremes. You're not supposed to barely eat anything or then eat a lot or then do this or that, right? It changes your shift point, it changes your metabolic rate, and it may produce epigenetic changes that turn on or off other hormones or other genes and things like that that may cause problems later in life. A lot of people who have experienced eating disorders early on, like women, may have trouble keeping weight off as they get older because it basically has crashed the system. So it's not just eating disorders, but crash diets can do the same thing. And I know that people think that, oh, low carb, we got to keep low carb. If you actually talk to nutritionists that get degrees for this stuff, they tell you that the normal diet should be 30% carbohydrates, 30% fats, and 40% protein. It's not supposed to be 5% carbohydrates, right? We do need that glucose that comes from carbohydrates in order for our body to maintain normal levels. So yes, it can cause the it can cause that fat to melt away, especially the first couple weeks of going no carb or low carb. But eventually, you don't want to keep your system at a low level. You want to at least have, right? And of course, most of us overload on the carbs, so it is good to cut down, but you don't want to get rid of them. Um, so that's my 2 cents. The last thing I'm going to say is that we also see a lot of comorbidity, which means double diagnoses of eating disorders with other psychological disorders such as obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Where you have reoccurring thoughts. I'm not thin, I'm not thin, I'm not pretty, I'm not good looking, I'm horrible looking. And so that whole idea of the obsessive and compulsions comes out with either not eating and being extremely stingy with your calories, or bulimic and you're binging and purging.
What about treatments for these things? Well, what we see in the genetic factors of people with eating disorders is reduced serotonin. Um, this is especially true in bulimics more than anorexics. And so a lot of times they'll be given antidepressant or SSRI treatments because those increase serotonin levels and seem to be effective in reducing binging and purging, as well as lowering relapse rates. And part of this system, when we talk about comorbidity, it's not just obsessive compulsive disorder. It could also be, of course, depression. You're not eating, or you're binging and purging, and it can cause you to become depressed. So one of the things genetics code for as well is not just the amount of serotonin, but maybe an imbalanced ratio of serotonin receptors. So those people are more likely to have eating disorders because they have impaired executive control over their emotional responses. And sometimes there's low activity in reward systems, such as the dopamine reward system or the cannabinoid reward system. Yes, the CBD or the THC receptors. So people may turn to eating disorders because they simply don't enjoy food as well as other pleasures. They're not getting that dopamine spike. Sometimes when we eat something we really like, of course, that causes that dopamine spike. That's what can cause us to get addicted to these things. So eating can increase dopamine levels, and sometimes just viewing pictures of food can stimulate those dopamine levels and cannabinoid receptors in anorexics and bulimics. Um, Obviously, we talk about marijuana as a therapy because it gives you the munchies. It makes people hungry. So sometimes THC is given as a medication for people who are anorexic to be able to um, get hungry and eat. So one of the other reasons that people may get into this is because they get anxiety from eating. They feel guilty after eating something they shouldn't. So eating also increases food-related anxiety. So we see depression, anxiety, we see obsessive compulsive as a comorbidity, right? Dual diagnosis, or maybe even more than two. So therefore, restriction, while it's not the best outcome or the most pleasurable, seems to work to at least reduce their anxiety. So if they don't eat, they can't feel guilty about eating it. I think we are finally done. Maybe I should have broken this up into 2 lectures, but you can always break this up into 2 parts that you listen to or follow along with. And I will interact with you guys soon. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. Talk to you soon.